So, without further ado, I'll just mention today's topic is on emergencies for wildfire season. And it's already happening, as we can hear from everybody here. So, um, I'll turn it over to Beth von Gunten, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, this is Beth von Gunten. I'm from the KPFK local station board and from the national board, National Pacific and National Board. And there I sit on the strategic planning committee. And the project I've been working on there is to bring focus to emergency management for Pacifica. And as I've worked on that, it's become apparent we need to look at it as a one component in an overall strategy of risk management as a whole. So just a little background. I grew up in the small farm towns in Indiana in the 50s and 60s. My early emergency preparedness experience had to do with tornadoes, mostly. Those were the more dramatic, but floods and blizzards and the horse got out in the middle of the night. You know, everybody was rousted until we got him back in, so he wouldn't be out on the road. It was very practical, hands-on culture, self-reliant, but also very cooperative. Neighbors were really important. Was self-organized. Your neighbors were who you lived your lives with, and back then everybody knew who their neighbors were in face-to-face, and it made a difference. I left that small town culture as soon as I had the opportunity and went to see the wider world and found WBAI first, but then KPFK also when I moved to California in the early 80s. I've been a Pacifica listener my entire adult life since then. I was elected to the local station board out here a year and a half ago now. I was seated, and the national board then last December. In terms of California wildfires, I've been through a few out here. I live in the small coastal mountain community of Ojai, about 30,000 people in the valley, 8,000 in the town proper. I live on the edge of that town. We're just below the Los Padres National Forest, where the condors are at home. So there's wilderness, and the backside of the mountain just above us is known as bear heaven for a reason. I've seen that the mountains around there burn several times over. There are only 4 roads in and out of that valley, and I've been there when all 4 went down at the same time and stayed down for more than a week. So that community tends to be very much aware of our vulnerabilities and what we need in an emergency, and that we depend a lot on each other as neighbors. And we've kind of been at the forefront of emergency preparedness within the county, I think because our vulnerabilities are so apparent to us. I went through the Day Fire in 2006 was the longest, most protracted, densest smoke I'd ever been in. That was for weeks that went on. And as an asthmatic, it pretty much floored me. There was discussion regularly among neighbors about rumors about that we might need to evacuate with very little notice and no actual practice at that, and no really good, reliable source of information. It was still, the internet hadn't been developed as to the extent that it has today. Those resources were still pretty sketchy. And so as a consequence of that, we asked, after surviving that, we asked our local supervisor. Each California county is governed by a board of 5 supervisors, and the one for our district took a special interest in emergency preparedness because of our location. They're in the mountains and with pretty precarious circumstances. So they went out and got the funding to bring community emergency response team training to the valley. And over the course of the next year or so, we got enough people trained to stand up neighborhood community emergency response teams. We divided the valley into 9 neighborhoods. Each was roughly walkable if you're ambitious as a walker, so that if motorized transportation was no longer an option for whatever reason, everything was still within the span of what was humanly possible to do with your neighbors. And that was a very productive decade or so. We worked with that. That there in that time, it was becoming apparent that the wildfires were growing significantly beyond anything that we were trained or equipped for. Not just us as community emergency response teams, but the fire department that trained us and everyone who backs them up. To that point, the fire departments in Los Angeles and Ventura County had been for decades at the cutting edge of researching and developing a lot of the most advanced emergency response practices. That's where community emergency response teams was born, and a lot of the history of the incident command system was developed here, because we get so much practice, because they're just we're on the coast, we're sandwiched between the coast and mountains and deserts, and a lot happens here, and it's a densely populated area, which escalates the potential losses. So when I was first trained, we were taught that we were extremely well equipped and well prepared, and not to worry, and that we could all train to be a part of that. And then the fires started escalating beyond anything that the current cohort of emergency responders were trained or equipped to, or to respond to, or that really could be humanly responded to. I wasn't in Ojai the night that the Thomas fire broke out. I was down in Ventura, which is on the coast at the time, and I started getting texts pretty much immediately within half an hour after that fire broke out in the mountains, and followed it over the internet at the time, and texting among friends who were on site and following it at the time. And we were told that it was moving down out of the mountains toward the town of Santa Paula, and that by morning it might be turning and moving toward the coast. And within less than that was like between 9 and 10 o'clock at night. Within less than an hour after that, I watched the sky over Ventura, which is a good 15 miles away, start to turn rosy red, and then you could begin to hear the roar. The wind was gusting 70 to 80 miles an hour that night in the direction from Santa Paula, and hours ahead of any warning that we had been given. That fire roared in along the foothills, and I watched as it started consuming hundreds of high-end homes on the hillside. And the firefighters were out in force, but there really wasn't much they could do other than try to stay ahead of it and evacuate people as fast as they could. There was no way to fight something like that. That was a wind-driven fire that tends to characterize these massive mega fires that we're facing now. And really, you're at their mercy, and the best you can do is just be prepared to be agile and stay out ahead of them, and have a sense of where they're coming from, where they're moving toward, and how to get out of their way, how to find a safe place to hunker down. That became, within the next couple days, that became the largest fire in California history. I think that was December of, what was it, 2018? Maybe it was 2017, but within the last 3 or 4 years. And at this point, the last time I looked, it was still within the top 10, but year by year by year, the fires are outstripping even that idea. It's still kind of beyond my imagination what that fire did to this county. And I know that counties up north have been through that and more now, and that given the state of the drought in the California and all of the West, we're likely in for at least that much again this year, and possibly worse. And there's only so much you can do to prepare for that. So there's a lot of rethinking in terms of recalibrating in terms of emergency management. And it sounds like most people on the call have their own experiences with emergency response, and some of you out here in the West, specifically with fires, and currently, you're facing that where you are. So there's probably not a whole lot more I can tell you about wildfire preparedness that you won't already, especially if you're interviewing a fire chief weekly. Good for you. You're ahead of the curve on that one. But I would like to sort of focus on emergency management, an overview of emergency management and how that's changing, especially as it relates to radio being broadcast radio being considered critical infrastructure. And then talk about where Pacifica and its affiliates network might fit into all of that.
That's
emergency, excuse me? Was there a question?
Oh, I was just going to say, that sounds great.
Okay, all right, thank you. So emergency management generally is broken down into several phases. It begins with planning, which has to do with identifying known hazards, and that'll vary from location to location. And the next step is mitigation, trying to reduce the threat from damage of those hazards. And then preparedness, whatever risk you can't mitigate, then you need to be prepared to deal with, the worst that could happen. Then moving on to response, in case those threats are realized, be it fire or flood or whatever. And then to that's immediate response in the moment while the emergency is still underway. And then afterwards, after you've put the fire out, after the waters recede, after the immediate incident, then you move into a time of recovery. And that leads back into reassessment and planning. So you complete the cycle and begin again. And it's intended to be an ongoing cycle, not just something you stand up when you need it, but something that any organization works through on an ongoing basis. And radio in particular is considered critical infrastructure. I should say broadcast radio in particular, because in an emergency, especially if people need to make decisions about whether to evacuate or shelter in place, or what to do next, what to prepare for, whether they're safe or not, often other sources of information become unavailable. Cell phone towers go down, the internet can go down, or just be overloaded. And it's in those times that people turn to their broadcast radio. They'll dig around in the trunk of the car or the back of a kitchen shelf or a drawer, looking for an old transistor they may not have used in quite a while, but it may be their only link these days to real-time live information. And that's especially so given that broadcast radio is by far more robust than digital media. As long as we maintain, as long as we design that robustness into the system, if we quote unquote upgrade or update our systems to make them entirely digital and dependent on the internet to get the signals from the station to the transmitter and out, then all bets are off, because the internet is not nearly as robust and stable as broadcast radio is. Well, Bruce had mentioned the possibility of working with the Pacifica affiliates to produce regular PSAs, public service announcements.
Yeah,
That would
he
be.
was talking about that a couple sessions ago or last time.
He mentioned it to me just this last week, and because he knows I've been working on this in other areas, and I think it's a brilliant idea. I don't know what we do now in that regard, but there would be a lot of resources available to do that. FEMA has an annual outreach cycle that kind of follows the nature of the emergencies that people are faced with at any given time. They're doing outreach on heat and hurricanes and fires right now, and given what's happened in Florida, then also in terms of building code and structural safety and that sort of thing. But they have a lot of outreach materials available for free. And if we were to take advantage of that and get in sync with them, then it would be well coordinated with other public service things that are out there. If in an emergency, people are casting around looking for any reliable source of information they can find, they'll resurrect that old broadcast radio and then search the dial looking for a signal. And if they get more than one signal, they'll switch back and forth till they find the more reliable local information. And there's just not a lot of that out there these days, given the state of broadcast medium. If we can be there for people in their hour of greatest need, I promise you they will never forget us. I've watched it transform a couple of local national public radio stations around that started out smaller and just happened to be positioned well to respond, to provide people with real-time live information during several of these recent fires. And you can really, really magnify the support you get. Those can be watershed events. If you're ready for them, if you're ready to respond to people's needs, it puts us on their map, and they will look to us again and again if we can be prepared in that moment.
It sounds like from Bruce that there's funding available for people who make PSAs.
Yes, there's. I'm working on this. This is part of why I brought it to the National Strategic Planning Committee. First of all, emergency. It's not optional to have an emergency response plan. Every business is required by OSHA to have a written plan. I know that California also requires a written plan, so that's both federal and state mandate. And yet many small businesses, many large businesses don't have a written plan, or don't know where to find it, or haven't exercised it in years. It was written by someone who was there long ago, and no one currently knows anything about it. They tend to fall into, unless there's an active plan an active a work group or task force, or unless it's somebody's specific assignment, those things tend to fall dormant. And so I'm working on that at the national level, because there really is very significant FEMA money available, on the order of the same magnitude as the PPP money that Pacifica got earlier this year. A couple of grants, each of which were over $1 million, that really were lifesavers to get us through the pandemic and other difficulties. And so it behooves us to figure out what it takes to qualify to receive that money. They want to see us to succeed, especially in these circumstances. They really need us to be effective at what we do. And they have money available for a wide range of processes and projects. And I'm looking at some of the larger funding, the larger grants for upgrading hardware and securing facilities and that sort of thing. But I know they have grants available for public outreach and that sort of thing too. I haven't looked into them specifically, but it wouldn't be hard to do. And I would be happy to work with anyone there at the affiliates unit to see to it that we can follow up on this, that we realize this potential.
Joseph is asking in the chat, who are they that will offer this money?
FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I'm not proposing that we turn over our operations to them, but if they have money to do what we need to do anyway, and we can qualify for it, I'm happy to let them help us strengthen our operation. I think we have a mutual interest in seeing to it that the public is provided with all the public safety information they need, both ahead of disasters in terms of preparedness, but real-time live during disasters too, so that everyone can hedge their bets in terms of just survival. There's been a lot of new research into emergency management and the aftermath of major incidences, given that all these major incidences are amplifying now, the wildfires, but also the hurricanes and flooding, and that doesn't seem to be. It seems there will be more of that in our future, not less. And so they're starting to speak more in terms of resilience than just sustainability, which after major incidences, some communities manage to come back and others don't. For some, it's like a permanent change to the extent that some small communities have just been completely wiped out. So there's been more research looking into what characterizes the more resilient communities. And some of the things are obvious. Money helps, of course, but some of the less obvious things, and one of the most consistent factors, turns out to be how well connected the community is within itself before the disaster hits. They're referring to this now as social capital or social networking, and they mean actual, not just virtual. How often do people see each other? How well do people know their neighbors? How many civic organizations are there, so that when something major happens, people know who to turn to. Those lines of communication are already open. You already know who you're talking to. If you can get somebody on the phone, And that seems to make a major difference in how well any given community weathers these major incidences and whether they're able to come back or not.
That's
And
interesting.
I'm
We have
really focusing on this a lot. Go ahead.
we have a question from Joseph, and then Bruce has joined us. He has a question too.
I was going to mention that FEMA, yes, we can probably apply to FEMA, but we can also, I think it would be wise to go to whoever is your force manager or your fire department, to whoever is in your area, their closest person, and have them put you in as a line item in their proposals and their applications to FEMA, and talk with them beforehand so you're getting a reasonable or handsomely paid contribution to your services for the assistance that they are providing. And I've gone through this before back in 1999 when we first started this organization within the HOOPA structure of coming up with an emergency task force. And the radio station was part of that initial process. And I tried to explain to them that when an emergency happens, and what we do at the radio station is go into an emergency mode where we cancel everything and we just stay live. We need live people. And we've always had very few people on staff. And they said, well, you can get some volunteers from other departments to come in. And I said, well, maybe they can do that. But you really need to have a crew that is funded on a full-time basis, just like you have their fire crew. There is a volunteer fire department, yes, but when it comes to wildland fires, we got this humongous fire station with several trucks, several crews that are all equipped, and they're there, and they strike out as needed. You also have an EMT crew. You don't say, oh my God, somebody's having a heart attack, let's get a volunteer to come down and help this person. No, you got a crew. Radio is exactly the same as important. You have to have a live crew, enough to maintain 24-hour operations if that's what you need. We did 72 hours straight with 3 people, and we were toast after 72 hours. Thank goodness the emergency was over by then, for us anyway. It was still an emergency for the community, but at least the water receded, and that's what we're keeping people informed about, is what's the height of the water and who's being threatened right now. Megrin fire in 99, it was like 2 months of bad air, and we had to maintain an ongoing per hour reminder of people to watch your elders, watch your children. If they show these symptoms, call the hospital, call your clinician, do something, be on the alert all the time. And when the CDC came here to visit and give a report and investigate, well, how well did we do this? What was the best practices? One of the top things that they mentioned was the use of the radio station in getting out these emergency announcements and how to take care of yourself. They didn't evacuate anybody, because the thing about evacuation, if a government tells you have to evacuate, they have to also provide you with everything that you need to evacuate. And so everything, they always declare voluntary evacuations. That's what we do in our community. So if you feel bad enough, volunteer to leave. But otherwise they were responsible for all your social needs, your rent to stay someplace, the food that you eat, the water that you drink. And that's a really strain on a small government. So they try to avoid that. And that's my update on that. Thank you.
Is it okay if I respond to that?
Oh, yes, please. And I forgot to ask you if, do you prefer to have questions at the end, or is it okay while you're presenting information?
Either way is fine with me. This is a small enough group and a cooperative enough group. It's not an interruption. It really helps guide the discussion. So I'm happy to take questions whenever they come up.
Okay, fantastic.
Well, and I wanted to respond to Jose. I mean, to me, that sounds like the voice of experience there. He's clearly been through it and learned a lot, and I'm sure has honed his skills that much more, and is very much aware of what works and what might have worked better and what could be done better the next time. And that's the way these things are designed to work. We locally here in Ventura County, we did it's the fire department. Ventura County Fire Department provide mostly, sometimes local town fire departments too, are the ones who provide active duty firefighters to train the community emergency response team volunteers. It's a course of like 7 evenings over the course of 7 weeks, and each component ends with a hands-on exercise at the end of the class. And I think we missed the boat a little bit in not doing more at the time to get those classes of people connected with each other on an ongoing basis. I mean, I was trained back in 2008, and this research on resilience, citing social capital, they're calling it, hadn't been done yet and has only recently come out. FEMA still tends to be organizing or training people one by one. You know, prepare yourself, prepare your family, and if you get that far, then check on your neighbor. And that's better than not checking on your neighbor, but it's not the same as a community organizing. And that's someplace where I think very local radio can make a difference there. I know that during the Thomas fire and then the subsequent Woolsey fire that hit Malibu so badly, since the fires before that, there had been many more people were using internet maps to navigate. And they discovered a problem in that those maps were guiding people to where the traffic was the least, which turned out to be where the fires were. I mean, that's why there was no traffic there, is because the fires were a deterrent. And it was only because local radio was on top of that and could talk to people in their cars as they were looking for a safe way out, that people knew not to just blindly follow what they were still seeing on their internet maps. I think that real-time live broadcast, there's just nothing comparable to that in those crunch moments. There's nothing like real-time live information. One of the regional NPR stations had staff members kind of scattered across a couple of counties that were interrupted by that Woolsey fire, the Malibu fire, and who weren't able to get to work because roads were down. And so they put them to work reporting from exactly where they were in the field. And from my perspective, some did better than others. One in particular, who was from an even closer station, didn't really move much past interviewing people in the street, asking, how does it feel to evacuate? How does it, tell me about your personal experience. And that's, that man in the street stuff does count, but it's not the same thing as knowing, if you're surrounded by smoke, knowing which direction it's coming from and therefore which direction to flee. And that's where the other radio station that I think was able to really capitalize on their experience in that fire, assigned their people, the people who couldn't get into the station, they assigned them to shadow the first responders and go to the incident command post and get their information real-time live from the people who were actually working the fire, and not just guess and not just report on individual people's distress in the street, which is real but not all that informative. And I watched how after that fire they gained so much support, so many new subscribers, that they were able to boost their signal a bunch, and they really grew in response to that. And I think we have the potential to do the same. It sounds like some of you folks out there already have positioned yourself well to do exactly that. I'd like to get to talk with Jose, and is it Michael also who works with me?
Joseph and
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I'd like to follow up with you and learn more about how you went about organizing what you do. I'd like us to do more of that here. I do think we haven't quite got there at the National Strategic Planning Committee yet, but I see us moving toward standing up an emergency management work group for the network. And I'd very much appreciate the more experienced or those with a greater interest from affiliates being involved with that. There, in terms of next steps, I see that as one of them, setting up a work group, but also working on our own readiness for any kind of media or a public service agency. There are two levels of readiness. The first is internal. Are we ready to take care of ourselves and each other in the immediate aftermath of a disaster? What kind of continuity of operation planning have we done? Will we be able to maintain the signal? What would it take to take our signal down, and what would it take to get it back up again? And do we have the parts on hand to do that, or how long would it take to get them? These basic logistical questions. And then once we have our internal readiness in order, then we'll be in a better position to address the external readiness, and help the community prepare and be ready to respond. So I'm really glad that others within Pacifica are thinking about these things and working on these things, and I'm glad we've found each other to this extent, and I look forward to whatever we can do to build on this.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'd be happy to, I can share your email in the chat, Beth, for those who want to get in contact with you. Is that okay?
Yes, please do. And you can make my telephone number available to people who are present at the meeting or others within the Pacifica network. I'm not sure I want to post it online, for the general public, because it's the only phone number I have. But if it's, for Pacifica identified participants, then I'm happy to take calls from anybody who wants to follow up on this.
Okay. I will.
And are there other questions?
I know Bruce had his hand up, and I see we're coming up on 4 o'clock. Sometimes we can go over, but I don't know what your time is like today, Beth.
I'm available. I can stay as long as need be.
Okay.
Well, I have the Pacifica National meeting later in the day, but I doubt it will go that long.
Okay.
Okay.
Bruce, you had your hand up.
Yeah, before I forget, I want to maybe ask Joseph if he can get together with Beth and do a write-up on those 3 incidents that you had, because that's a really good selling pitch to go to fire management people and FEMA and say, this is a real thing that happened, and this is what we did, and this is how we added value to what you're trying to do. Um, and I don't know if Beth mentioned it. There's money for resilience, um, putting resilience into your emergency plans, resilience into your radio station, and they will pay you, they'll give you money to do emergency generators, all that kind of stuff, if you come up with a proposal. But I want to highlight something that's maybe even more important than the money. If your local population knows that you are the authoritative source for real fire information from the real people who know what's really going on, they're going to be tuning into your station. It's not going to be some kind of talking head on the news with a picture of a fire in the background. It's going to be your local um, forestry person. Put them on the air. It's going to be your local county fire management people. Put them on the air. And if they know that they can depend on an update, maybe 3 times a day on what's happening, they'll be tuning in, and you can do fireproofing tips. You can do interviews with your local fire people. Here's, John Williams, who's the head of La La La. And I think it's really going to drive your listenership in terms of people who are worried about the fire. And the other thing too is, we really only have 3 months before the fire season is over, so we don't have a whole lot of time. Sometimes it's easier, and Beth has had this experience, sometimes it's easier to just go out and meet the people who are in charge and say, my name is Bruce, I got a little radio station, how can I help? And then you have these conversations, and then they know about a program that you didn't even know about, and they said, you know what, we're going to expedite this because it's the middle of July and we don't have time for a 6-month proposal process. I'm going to put you in, or like Joseph said, I'm going to put I have a discretionary funds in my budget. I'm going to allocate money to you for this for the next 3 months. And I think meeting the people who are involved in fighting the fires and managing the fires and getting the information out is almost more important than anything else. And you have the advantage that the commercial stations are simply not interested. They don't care. I mean, they're really not interested in providing, quality fire information. And half of them are clear channel stations on remote management anyway. So anyway, that's it. I'm done.
Thanks, Bruce.
May I respond to that
Yes,
a bit?
please.
Thanks. Well, first, it used to be that our fire season lasted only about that long, but the biggest fires in California history have been taking place. The Thomas Fire was December, others have been January. They're now talking about a 12-month fire season. And to me, that looks realistic. I agree that it really pays to get connected with your local first responders in whatever way they're open to. I've learned, I went to our my neighborhood fire station when I first organized neighborhood community emergency response team meetings, and I knocked on their door just to let them know that we were there and let them know they're always welcome. And the person who answered the door was a firefighter, and he looked a little bemused and wasn't quite sure what to do with me, and he said he'd make a note of it and get back to me. And it took about like less than 12 hours for my knock on his door to get amplified right up the chain of command to the fire chief for the county, who then called my county supervisor and had his staff person who covers that portfolio call me and ask, is there a problem? What do we need? What do you need? What can we do for you? And so I learned a lot about command and control and internal communication systems, and that there are people there for that. And that if I was green at the time, in more sense than one, and I learned better how to direct my communication so as not to distress the system. But it really did help to get connected with the community emergency response team. Training is free, and I suspect I'll be resurrecting that now that we're trying to get beyond the pandemic. And if you come across it in your community, it's well worth taking the time to do it. Initially I thought, well, yeah, I grew up in farm country. I'm pretty practical. I'm not worried about whether I can, deal with the practicalities of an emergency, because we were kind of brought up that way. But when they got to the section on the incident command system and how they organize, and so to help us know how to coordinate with what they're doing, what vocabulary they use, what their considerations are, how to organize ourselves if there's no first responders. The first thing they tell you is that 95% of rescues in real disasters are neighbors, friends, bystanders, family. They're not first responders because that's the definition of a disaster, is that there's more need than there is capability to respond. And so it's up to whoever's there at the time. And this was a community emergency response team came out of watching what happened in the Mexico City earthquake back in the early 90s, I think it was, where so many people were trapped under rubble, and they lost even more spontaneous volunteers trying to get them out. And they thought, the firefighters, search and rescue people thought after that, with even just some basic training, very basic training, those volunteers would have been safer and would have been more successful in what they were doing and would have survived their heroism. And so the CERT program was born, and it continues to be revised. It put me in touch with the infrastructure within the fire community in our county. I ended up volunteering as a volunteer victim, and I got rescued from all kinds of, they'd bring the urban search and rescue from up and down the coast here and extract us from various buildings. So I got to see the real first responders and how they actually behave in the field and what their considerations are and how they proceed and how they plan an operation. And so that was fun. Another useful avenue is ham radio. The year after I got my CERT training, I went and got my first ham radio license. I'm never going to have the money to invest in the kind of toys you would have to get to be one of the premier ham guys, because they're still mostly guys. But it was enough to get my foot in the door to the monthly auxiliary communication system, who are the ham radio guys prepared to volunteer in emergencies. And they meet in all the various incident command posts around the county throughout the year. So I got to see the inside of all those facilities and find out where they were located and see how they're set up and meet the people who run them. And it put me in touch with a lot of people, a lot of very, very tech savvy and radio savvy people, many of whom are radio professionals or tech professionals or broadcast professionals in their day job. And that's been invaluable. It's a real window into how the system works. And it gives me people to call when I need advice about these kinds of things. So I would recommend that. If you've never had a ham radio before, or ham radio license before, if you can pass a driver's license test, you can pass a ham or an FCC ham license test, an entry-level technician. There's a pool of a few hundred questions, and you have to answer 30 some of them in the test, and it's a pass-fail thing, and I managed to do it on my first try with just a couple days to study ahead. And if I can do it, you guys can too if you haven't already. And it puts you in that loop then, and it gives you people to call on in a pinch. So
That's a new avenue that we haven't talked much about yet on our roundtables, is the ham radio angle. I'm sure there's more to discuss on that. I just want to go back a second to Ursula has a comment.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I really, thank you. I really love the idea of trying to create something coordinated. We have some more stations in the network like KMUD who, have years and years of experience as well, because they're also in Humboldt County like Joseph is, and kind of that partly their bread and butter is fire reporting.
They wanted to be here, but waiting for the recording. Yeah.
But I think that, both what you're saying and what Joseph said are points really well taken. The idea of getting FEMA money is very compelling, but the devil is really in the details, because so like kind of to point to what you were just saying right there, when we started KHOI here, we have a good emergency coordination system here in Story County, a very good coordinator. But when we went to him and said we'd like to help, he made it very clear right off the bat that when there's an emergency, the last thing he wants to do is deal with a radio station. That he has his own systems of communication, which are mostly cell phone based, and warning systems, and he doesn't want to have to deal with another group. And so there's like what you were saying, there's that. It's like entering into the information loop isn't just a matter of goodwill. You really do kind of have to earn your stripes and fit yourself into what feels to them like a help, instead of one more media group that is going to be in their way when they're trying to get something done. So now, so what we did with him is we put him on once a month to because like most emergency coordinators, what he really cares about and loves is preparation. Is the first part you talked about, is prevention and preparation. And so he comes on once a month and he talks about that, and he sounds like your grandmother, like be careful of this, but he's like the worrier, right? But it did gain his trust, and so after about 5 years of that, the day did arrive when he said, well, if you'd like, I can put you into our information loop. Okay, so that leads me to Joseph's point, which is very well taken, which is that that's easier said than done, because you have to have people that can really respond. And the truth is, even though Keith is our emergency manager, even though he has kind of opened the door, I've not been able to take him up on it really, because we don't have a staff, we don't have a group of people who actually could show up like that. And so I'm just saying that these are the kind of devil in the details that I would love to see addressed. For instance, does FEMA money pay for people to be on standby? That sounds incredibly expensive to me. So these are questions that really have to be addressed. How do you solve them when you're a station like ours, which is relatively small, and we don't have, KMUD has a news department, but even then it takes a huge cost on the station when they have fires. So, it's the practical details that really have to be answered first. And if there's any way these can be kind of teased out, that would be really, really helpful. Because, I'd love to apply for FEMA money, and I'd love to work with the emergency coordinators, but I don't think we have enough to offer to really deserve that yet. So, we deserve everything, but you know what I mean, to really have the systems in place for that. So I would just love to hear ideas about that and how to solve those ideas. And, we do have a ham operator club in Ames, but they're not that excited about helping the radio station, they kind of have their own thing, they have their own transmitters stuck on top of the hospital and this and that. And I haven't been able to find a motivation yet for them to work with us. So these are kind of the questions. I just have a bunch of kind of questions and issues that I'd love to see, looked at. Thank you.
Do you have a response for that, Beth?
Sure. I think
Sure, that was a lot.
that was an excellent set of considerations, and it kind of lays out for me the best explanation for why we need an ongoing group. In my experience, it was not easy to it's still actually not easy to break into that ham radio circle. In my experience, they are a pretty closed bunch of guys, and I'm clearly not one of them. And some of you will make me welcome, but not everybody does, and I have to just kind of buck up and go anyway. And initially, the local Ojai Valley group was the same bunch of 8 or 10 techie guys who they loved their ham radios, and that's what they wanted to talk about in their monthly meeting. And so when CERT, Community Emergency Response Teams, went out and got 30 of us to pass the local ham radio, or the FCC ham radio test, and we showed up at the monthly meeting, we completely outnumbered them. And our interest was emergency response, not, the higher end of the ham radio hobby. And so there was clearly a culture clash for a time, and they've kind of worked it out. And it took them 10 years or so. And there's the fact that ham radio, amateur radio, is strictly non-commercial. It's not allowed to operate in or support commercial operations. But if they have crucial information, there's nothing to stop them from reporting that to a facility that could get that word out to beyond just the ham radio community. And those are the kinds of connections it takes time to even find where the openings might be, and then cultivate the relationship over time, and a backup relationship, because sooner or later that person will cycle out of the loop, and you're going to need someone else who can carry on if you persist with it long enough. And again, they're listening to what Ursula had to say. To me, that sounded like the voice of experience. And we'd be ahead of the game if we take time to get together and learn from each other, and move forward together in a more organized way. Because I only see these needs increasing over time. And I especially think that the public are going to need more sources of reliable information than just the authorities, who aren't going to be enough. We need to keep in touch with them, but we should be reporting beyond what they're reporting. My own considerations in all of this are informed by my reading of the book, The Shock Doctrine, which I would highly recommend if anybody hasn't already taken a look at that. There's not time to go into it today, but it definitely informs my considerations. So I'm going to continue working on this at the national level, at the Strategic Planning Committee, and I will soon be proposing standing up a work group, a Pacifica-wide work group. I don't want to propose a committee, because that is too complicated. You end up with too many rules about who can and who can't take part, and how they can take part, and who gets to vote and who doesn't, and then the year ends and it all turns over again and you start over. If we make it a work group, then none of those rules will stand in our way, and we can just focus on the task at hand. And I would love to include anyone from the affiliates who have longstanding interest or concerns or experience with this. I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. And I signed up for a lot of the FEMA requests for proposals, so I get those requests for grant proposals on a regular basis, and I hope soon to be able to direct those to people who are in a better position to actually act on them. So if I know what people's needs are, and if we can all help each other get better positioned and better prepared to qualify for those grants, and then track who is able to get the grants and what works and what doesn't, and I think we'll all be in a better position to strengthen the organization as a whole and be ready or more ready for whatever comes next. I don't think any of us know, what all we're in for. I mean, it's the pandemic. For all I've given lots and lots of consideration to all this emergency management stuff for well over a decade now, the pandemic really did blindside me. I was not expecting anything of that nature along those at this scale. And that's still, I don't think we're done with it yet, to be honest. But there will be more in our future that we haven't anticipated yet, and I'll feel better facing all that if I know we're in it together. And I'd like this to be a first step toward that.
Thank you, Beth. And if anyone wants to communicate through me, Beth, to people, or people through me to Beth, you're always welcome to do that too in the future if you get a group going. I see Bruce has a question or comment.
Yeah, I mean, basically, fires are not the only thing. As a matter of fact, July 13th, FEMA is having another webinar on food insecurity in Iowa. And Kathy Fields is the FEMA directress for Region 7, and I gave her Stephanie's phone number. So you should be expecting a call. No, I'm joking. But, food insecurity is something that's it's not as time sensitive as fires say. So, I mean, just the fact that the radio station can be putting out PSAs and telling people where to go, who to call, what's the local food pantry, and getting, you need to stress that we are going to be reaching people who don't have internet because they can't afford it, and don't read newspapers, and maybe don't speak English. So you're going to be doing PSAs in Spanish or some other languages. That's a real service, and I think FEMA would probably appreciate it. And just touching on what Ursula said, I mean, different supervisors are going to be different. Some are not going to, are not going to be interested in having people messing with their organization and a little protective. Others are going to be like, oh, wow, great. Let me know what you can do, and I'll fit you in. It's really a question of meeting the people and then finding out what they need. If you go and you ask them, well, what can I do to help? It's a totally different conversation, and then they'll come up with some ideas. But food insecurity, some of the other FEMA programs aren't as time critical as fire, and it's probably something else that the station can offer. And I really do think it will drive listenership. People tell other people, oh, food pantry, all right, well, listen to KHOI at noon, because they always have an announcement about like what's going on and who has a food day and yada yada yada. And you can even offer a premium of the hand crank radio, so like there's no electricity. Well, you know, become a member of the radio station and we'll send you one of those hand crank radios. There's, I mean, all kinds of things, but if you won't know until you ask. So, the best thing to do is to go and meet the people, and then, all right, so nothing happens, nothing happens. I mean, the thing with the 5 major stations, they're all in urban areas, so I don't imagine we're going to have a forest fire in New York. The stations that are really probably going to be facing, disasters and flooding and forest fires are the smaller rural stations. New York City is not going to have a forest fire, and Houston is not going to have a forest fire. They might have a hurricane or something. Anyway, that's it. I'm done.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate that. This has been a wonderful talk, guys. Thank you so much, Beth,
Thank you.
being with us today.
My pleasure. I'll look forward to whatever further contact we can have.
Yeah, we can keep it going. So we'll keep that in mind. Does anyone have any final thoughts they want to end with? Okay, I think we said a lot. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of stations who couldn't make it today who will be grateful to see the recording of this. So thank you again for that too. And yeah, let's keep in touch. So thank you again, Beth, and thank you, Bruce, for inviting Beth. And we'll see.
My pleasure.
Yeah. We'll see you in the future.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.